I've got the easiest job of anyone at this conference. I'm to introduce you to somebody that you already know. A lot of you know Murray personally. Either you've been lucky enough to work with him and study with him like I have, or maybe you met him on a trip to Boston, where you probably enjoyed the hospitality for which the Sidmans are very well known. Or maybe you met him in the course of his travels, which have been extensive, across the States and Europe and the Far East, and especially to Brazil, where, as Julio DeRose told us a couple of years ago at this conference, he was initially known in the town of San Carlos as that nice fellow that accompanies Rita Sidman on her trips to Brazil. If you don't know Murray personally, most probably know of him through his work. Depending upon how much gray you have in your hair, you might think first of the work on unsignaled avoidance or the work on stimulus equivalence, two research areas that will always be associated with his name. It was the equivalence research that prompted Bill McIlvaine at this conference about 6 years ago to remark that Murray was certainly in a class by himself. And there are a large number of other areas where you may have contacted his work. To name just a few, there's aphasia, there's analysis of stimulus generalization, there is conditional discrimination analyses, errorless learning, stimulus control, topography shaping. And his topic for today, which is one that might be a little bit less familiar to you, which is applied research with people who have mental retardation. And this is an area where Murray and his team from the Mass General Hospital are truly among the pioneers. But even if you haven't read anything by Murray Sidman yet, if you've read anything at all that's been published in JAV or JABA, then you've made indirect contact with the influence of his book, Tactics of Science, published in 1960, something that's done a lot to influence the way the science of the analysis of behavior is done. So I think that covers everybody here. If I'm wrong, and maybe you've wandered in on your way to the Magic Kingdom, my advice is to stick around and to join us in welcoming our friend and our teacher, Murray Sidman.
Thank you. Thank you all for your greeting. I want to thank Bill Paglia for arranging everything so nicely. And, of course, I want to thank Bill Doobie for that wonderful introduction. Of course, he's an old friend. He's prejudiced. Someday, there are some very good things to be said about him, too, and maybe someday I'll have the opportunity to introduce him. It's an honor and a privilege to be given an opportunity to speak to this particular group. I see many of my old friends here, and it's nice to see friendly faces in front, especially. I'm many also whom I hope will become new friends. Most of you actually will be hearing nothing new from me today. Indeed, many of you have similar stories to tell. I hope, though, that you'll still find my story interesting and my concerns worth attending to. I'm going to say a few things today about some work my colleagues and I did from 1965 to 1975 in an institution for people who are characterized as mentally retarded. One could easily argue that most of what we learned in those early days has since become standard practice. But I have two main reasons for dredging up this old material now. First, it's become evident to me that except for some superficial features, a number of the so-called standard practices are rarely practiced. By describing some of what we learned in what must seem to some of you like the beginning of time, I hope that those of you who are always seeking more effective behavior change techniques from our experiences. My second reason for taking a new look at things we did many years ago is a tension that I see developing between experimental and applied behavior analysts. I hear some claiming that the experimental analysis of behavior should not be contaminated by applied interests. From the other direction, I hear that the experimental analysis of behavior no longer has relevance to applied behavior analysis. Well, I'm not just concerned that adherence to one of these points of view will destroy the other, but that they will each destroy themselves. I'm quite convinced, first of all, that the applied analysis of behavior will stagnate and die unless it continues to draw contributions from the experimental science. Second, I'm equally convinced that the experimental science of behavior will not survive by itself. It needs an effective, allied, applied science. A third group, made up of individuals who are both scientists and practitioners, is essential. The scientist-practitioner tradition is the key. If we are to expect the public to continue to support behavioral science, then as scientists, we must translate our principles into practice. And as practitioners, we must become scientists in our evaluation of procedures and outcomes. Behavior analysts have to accept these responsibilities if we are to convince others that it is in their best interests to support us. And by support, I refer not just to research funds, but also to financial support for clients, that is to say, for those who could benefit from the practice of our science. And I refer to political support for the passage of laws that require effective practices. If we do not collaborate in generating such support, the world is not going to let us continue with either our science or our practice. Now, I'm not going to elaborate these points or cite evidence. Instead, I'm going to tell a little story about how a group of laboratory investigators learned a long time ago that they possessed an almost unbelievably effective set of applied behavioral tools. A set of tools that work both in principle and in actuality. In telling this story, I hope to convey a sense of the obligation we assume by investigating, teaching, and practicing the powerful technology that B.F. Skinner laid the foundations for. Let me give just a little background. The building in which we began our work housed 72 boys ranging in age from 6 to 20 years, most of them between 10 and 15 years. On first entering the building in January 1965, we found the boys just lying or sitting around, most of them unclothed and unwashed. There were no teachers, just caretakers called attendants, who were able to do little more than to see that the boys did not seriously harm themselves or each other. The boys swarmed all over us, picking at our clothing, fingers, faces, and pockets, pushing, pulling, pinching, scratching, and sometimes biting, uttering incomprehensible noises, and in general, frightening us all. At meals, many took food from each other, dumped food on each other on the floor, and required continuous supervision. Some had learned to feed themselves with a spoon, but most still ate with their hands or had to be fed. A few could dress themselves, but the attendants found that they could devote more time to housekeeping if they dressed the boys, or just as often left them sitting or standing around the room naked. Well, here we were, a group of laboratory people, scientists, technicians, and students, stepping into behavioral chaos. We had no applied behavior analysis texts to guide us. Ion and Azrin had published an account of their token economy at Anna State Hospital, and I was inspired by a visit to Girardeau and Spradlin's token economy in the Institute for the Retarded at Parsons, Kansas. Except for this pioneering work and a few other exciting reports, our guidance came from the behavioral principles that we had seen in action with non-humans and humans in highly automated, well-controlled laboratories. I'll talk here about only the first few months of our project, January through May, when we learned the most. Our first efforts were devoted to gaining experience ourselves as we attempted to apply principles we had learned in the laboratory. We therefore held frequent conferences at which each of our staff talked about his or her daily activities on the project. These conferences, recorded and transcribed, depict the general methodology we followed, our problems, and some of the solutions we developed. Excerpts from the conferences will illustrate quite concretely what we found we had to learn. You'll soon realize that much of my story is less about the boys than about ourselves. The transformation from scientist to scientist practitioner opened up a new world of reinforcers for our own behavior. One of our first surprises was the discovery that many of the boys were capable of doing more than they usually did. Much of our initial effort was directed at bringing out behavior they already had, but which they had had no reason to engage in. We found that we could accomplish much by simply applying basic contingencies. For example, as soon as we stopped accepting the boys' noises, gestures, and other body language, and started instead to reinforce them for speaking, we found verbal behavior emerging. It had been there all the time, but had served no useful function. What consequences could we provide that would increase and maintain the behavior that produced them? At that time, we were still able to use M&M candies. Our society had not yet decided that dental development was more important than behavioral development. In the laboratory, we had learned to use a simple test. Place a candy in the palm of our hand, show it to the child, close our fist fairly tightly around the candy, and see if the child will try to pull our fingers away to get at the candy. If he or she will do that, even against increasingly tightly held fingers, the candy is obviously a reinforcer. And candy, of course, can only be a starter. Eventually, one has to move on to reinforcers that are socially more acceptable and that are more appropriate to the tasks that are being taught. But it's important to recognize that few of those acceptable and appropriate reinforcers are naturally effective. Just as acts and actions have to be taught, so do reinforcers. A primary task was to develop conditioned and generalized reinforcers. We began with tokens, plastic poker chips. Later, after the boys had learned to save tokens and to understand numbers, we were able to introduce points. For some, points led eventually to money. As the boys saw how pleased we were when they earned the tokens and points that brought them other reinforcers, our pleasure also became important to them, and we became able to use praise as a reinforcer. As they learned more and more, many of the boys found that what they learned permitted them to deal more effectively with their gradually enlarging world. And for them, learning itself became reinforcing. At first, the boys could trade the tokens for candy, and the system caught on quickly. We were soon able to install a store where they could trade their tokens for many other items, toys, self-care items, clothing, coloring books, and so on. Later, our pupils became able to appreciate and to purchase desirable activities: roller skating, going for a walk, using a tricycle, listening to a record or tape, games, books, trips, the company of particular people, and for more advanced boys, private time and private space. Roller skates proved to be particularly effective toys. They were old-fashioned plastic four-wheeled skates that could be used both indoors and outdoors. We first taught the boys to walk on the skates while we held their outstretched hands. The next step was to require them to move a few inches without support until they reached and grasped our outstretched hands. And gradually we lengthened the distance they had to come to reach us. Keith originally tended to move in a fashion that can best be described as sloppy and floppy. When he first put on roller skates, it became evident that he had been paying no attention to the positions of his feet and legs. Within 5 minutes after he had put on the skates, he was giving close regard to his feet. putting them down very carefully, only a few inches from each other whenever he moved. This carefulness seemed to carry over to his normal walking and greatly improved his general appearance. In the first 4 months of the project, the boys made considerable progress in our original program of self-care activities. Although a sensitive visitor to the building was still likely to be depressed at what he saw, most of our boys were usually dressed. Only rarely did one find urine or feces on the floor. Several had learned to make beds and to help the attendants with this chore. Most of the boys now fed themselves, carried their empty dishes to the kitchen, and were considerably more orderly during meal times. Several had been taught to take complete care of the dining room with only minimal supervision, serving food, clearing and cleaning tables, and setting out dishes and utensils for the next meal. They received tokens for all these activities. We can turn the projector off for a few minutes. Okay. Kathy and I have done this before. We have to do a nice song and dance together here. Modern textbooks and courses list all the practices that I've noted: identifying existing behavior, finding reinforcers, and developing conditioned and generalized reinforcers. Unfortunately, reading books and listening to lectures set no contingencies on the behavior of readers and listeners. Missing is a particular kind of experience, along with its accompanying reinforcement. Such experience is tellingly illustrated by an excerpt from Harry Mackay's report of his initiation of our token system. I'll identify the participants in our conferences by their initials and the boys by their first names. And here's what Harry reported. I'm sorry, for those of you who know him, I can't imitate his Scottish accent. HM said, "I went in and sat on a table beside one of the attendants. Very quickly, there were 10 or 15 boys grouped around us. After handing out only a few candies, I started to use tokens. What I did was simply to put tokens into the hands of 3 or 4 of the brighter boys, take them back quite quickly initially, and at the same time put a candy into the other hand. In a short time, I was able to hand out 5 or 6 tokens to the boys nearest to me, and then take back the tokens and hand out the candies to these boys in turn. Then the attendant suggested it might be a good idea if he took the tokens down to one end of the room while I went to the other end with the candies. When we did this, most of the boys who had been grouped around the attendant and myself followed me. I had the candies, and they knew it. Only 1 or 2 went with the attendant, who had the poker chips. But very quickly, we had a steady stream of the boys running back and forth between this attendant and myself, picking up poker chips, returning them for candies, and going back through the cycle again. Then we switched, with me handing out tokens and the attendant handing out candy in exchange. For a time, I wandered about the room handing out tokens with a fairly large following of the boys. In the midst of the session, Dennis, a boy with deformed and useless legs, who had been sitting on a bench, crawled over and made quite obvious attempts to get my attention so that he could be given a token. He was told to go to the attendant and get his candy, and very soon he was back again. The behavior appeared to be well established. Toward the end of the session, I got 2 cups and 2 or 3 of the boys. I put the token under one of the cups and asked them to point to which of the cups had the token under it. Bobby and 1 other were also quite successful when the cups were switched around a little before they got the opportunity to point to the one that had the token under it. At this point, Dennis crawled over. I started merely to hand him a token. He made it quite clear, however, that this was not what he wanted. He pointed to the cups quite emphatically and was very happy when I put the token under one of the cups and let him pick the cup up to get the token. Well, it's important that practitioners experience incidents like this. Academic instruction is not enough. It's important that basic scientists experience incidents like this. They will never see them in the laboratory. On that first day, 15 to 20 boys showed complete understanding of the tokens. 4 months later, at least 80% of the boys were accepting token reinforcers. A great problem, as might have been expected, was to teach the boys to save tokens and use them later. We had to work individually with many of the boys to teach them to do this. We started by giving them a candy for each token immediately after they earned it, and gradually increased the time they had to hold on to a token before they could trade it in. With some, we had to increase this delay period by only seconds at a time. Our laboratory experience had alerted us to such necessary details. It's not enough just to give tokens and ask pupils to save them. Training in token exchange and token saving will often require exquisitely detailed procedural modifications. As we increase the time a pupil must hold on to tokens before exchanging them, or as we increase the number of tokens that must be saved, the pupil will tell us if we're moving too fast. The tokens will lose their value, and his behavior will deteriorate. Like a basic researcher working with reinforcement schedules, a teacher must learn to recognize the signals, recover the behavior by going back to an earlier step, and reprogram the delay or the number of tokens that are required for exchange. Effective teachers, therefore, have to be able to do more than recite basic principles. Principles do not give us procedures written in stone. The advantage of knowing the behavioral principles is that we can then knowledgeably modify procedures to fit an individual. We must remain attuned to the pupil's messages and be ready to try modifications and to evaluate them. Teaching, then, is not just a matter of changing the behavior of pupils. It's an interactive social process. To teach effectively, the behavior of the teacher must also be modifiable in accord with contingencies that the pupil's behavior sets up. As Skinner pointed out, experimentation, too, is a social process, an interaction during which subject and experimenter each influences the behavior of the other. A technique that we discovered was quite effective for teaching actions that required several steps was chaining, particularly the procedure that has come to be known as backward chaining, or simply back chaining. How did we know about chaining and back chaining? These were, and still are, standard laboratory procedures for establishing behavioral baselines. Our basic science had prepared us. The following interchange took place between me and one of our less experienced staff. MP said, "Yesterday I worked mainly with Paul. I drew lines and Paul copied them quite nicely. I then went on to squares, but he wasn't completing them. He'd get sort of partially around and then he'd start going on circle shapes again. So I decided to do all but one side of the square and let him fill that in. And that he did quite well. First, I left out the corner. Then, I left out the whole side. I was going to go on and fade out the whole square until he was drawing the whole thing by himself. But at that point, he sort of decided he didn't want to play squares anymore." MS. "Well, that would have been a good way to do it. Were you giving him tokens?" MP. "I gave him a token every time he filled in the part of the square that I left blank." MS. "Well, when did you cash in the tokens?" MP. "I didn't cash them in." MS. "Do you think that possibly his not wanting to play squares anymore had anything to do with the tokens not paying off?" MP. "Well, it might be, because I wasn't cashing them in at the time he was getting them." MS. "Well, possibly you didn't have to cash in each one. When he has 2 or 3 tokens, cash them in, and you'll find that probably he'll stay longer. The tokens are not rewarding by themselves. They have to lead to something." Now, Paul copied very nicely. Why don't you go on and have him copy other things? MP. Well, I was doubtful that I could get him to copy anything difficult. MS. Well, you don't have to start with something difficult. He copied nicely when you built up the square gradually. Do the same thing with the letters of the alphabet, or even his name. MP. What would you suggest? Do the same kind of thing? Put down the whole name and just leave out a tiny bit? MS. Right. Put down the whole name. What's the last thing Paul has to do in writing his name? MP. Well, he has to put the tail on the L. MS. Okay. Put down the whole name except for the tail and let him finish it. Work backwards. Even before that, you want to make sure that he can recognize different letters. You might first get him to pick the letters of his name from all the others. Get him to recognize those particular letters before you teach him to draw them. Then get him to recognize his name and what it means, so that when he finishes, it will be rewarding to him. If all you do is have him finish something he doesn't recognize as meaningful, then you may not be completing a chain at all. It may just be a series of unrelated movements and stimuli. The technique is essentially the same thing you did with the square, except that with a word, you may have to go back a little further to get him first to recognize it. Finally, as you build the chain backwards, the pupil may start to make mistakes. You have to be prepared to make changes, backing up, reteaching elements, and making sure the reinforcers are still effective. Here's another interaction along the same lines. DT said, I tried to teach Stevie to print his name. I started by having him copy, since he seemed able to do this. I pointed out his name and then drew a line farther down on the page and told him to copy it. Then I wrote the whole alphabet on a piece of paper and asked him to find an S, first showing him which was the S in his name. By rewarding him with tokens and encouragement, I was able to get him to pick out the S, T, I, and E. MS. Well, that's obviously a prerequisite for what you want. The boys have to be able to tell one letter from the other before you can expect them to write them. DT. Well, after he'd copied his name, Stevie, I turned the paper over and said, draw me an S. He was able to do this. I asked him to draw the next letter, and he drew an E. He drew these two letters from memory, but got hung up. MS. So you ran up against a roadblock. What might you do to get over it? The problem was to get him to write the letters of his name in the correct sequence, from memory. DT. I told him he'd left out a letter. MS. Well, that was a pretty big jump. DT. Well, we want him to write his name from memory. MS. S, T, E, V, I, E. DT. Oh, we should first have him copy all the letters of his name. Well, he can already do this. Then we should give him S, T, E, V, I and tell him to finish it. MS. Very good. Start at the end of the chain. Give him the first 5 letters and ask him to supply the final E. Then give him the first 4 letters. Have him supply the final IE. Work backwards. I should point out that each line here on this transparency, each trial actually appeared on a separate card. Again, with a relatively inexperienced staff member, I said, suppose you want to teach a boy to put his shirt on. How would you go about that? SR answered, I'd first encourage him to put one arm in, and I would then put the rest of his shirt on and give him a candy. MS. In working with the boys and writing their names, several of us have been using a technique that's been quite successful. For example, first you have Stevie copy his whole name. Then you give him all but the last letter and let him print the E, finishing the name right away. Then work backwards, having him put in the IE and then the VIE, and so on. This is a generalizable procedure. You have a long chain of behavior to teach. If you start at the beginning of that chain, it's going to be a long time before the pupil is rewarded by completing the task. It's a much harder job that way. SR. Then you would put the shirt on the boy and first have him simply pull it down. MS. That's right. SR. And then you could put in one arm and let him put in the other and pull the shirt down. MS. You have to analyze the motions that actually go into the activity and then work backwards. And this critical feature of backchaining is often overlooked. is while learning earlier links in a chain, pupils can always complete the subsequent links successfully because they've already learned them. And therefore, reinforcement on each trial is inevitable. The technique is important if the completion of the behavior is itself rewarding to the pupil. You can teach boys to tie their shoes that way, if they want to tie their shoes. But if they're not interested in the final product for its own sake, you have to depend on the tokens rather than the completion of the activity. Then I don't think it'll matter whether you work from the beginning or the end. What else can we do to make the completion of dressing reinforcing? Other things besides giving tokens. SR, well, we might bring in some different types of candy. MS, what would be relevant to being fully dressed? SR, well, going out. MS, going out for a walk. They can't go unless they're dressed. Or let the boys join some of the more desirable activities as soon as they have finished dressing themselves. The dressing is important. It has an effect on all of us who are working with the boys. It changes our attitude toward them and generally makes us all more effective with them. And a diary entry by Mrs. Cassidy illustrates her back-chaining method for teaching the most severely retarded boys to feed themselves. BC wrote, I've started to teach Michael to feed himself. When he first came to us, he was 7 years old and still drinking from a bottle. He looked more like 2. He is now about 10 and looks about 4 or 5. At meal times, he usually screams until someone starts to feed him. First, I tried to get him to hold a spoon while I fed him. I would not give him a spoonful of food unless he held his spoon in his hand. After about 3 tries, he finally held the spoon. Quickly, I put food in his mouth. He dropped the spoon. I put it back in his hand again. Finally, he held the spoon for 3 spoonfuls. I then put my hand over his hand and filled his spoon with food and guided it into his mouth. After about 4 tries at this, I let go of the spoon just outside his mouth, and he put the spoon the rest of the way in. At the end of the meal, he would finish bringing the food up to his mouth from about 3 inches away and would then drop the spoon into the bowl. I would then place my hand over his hand, fill the spoon, and start guiding it up to his mouth, letting go a little further away each time. A week later, she wrote, Michael managed to eat by himself today. He still has difficulty getting a full spoon, but he's learning. He still has to have the spoon placed in his hand, and he still requires the person who's feeding him to be where he can see them. If not, he gets up from the table and wanders off. But this is only natural, because all his life, when the adult left, the meal was over. Mrs. Cassidy, who was in charge of the building, had never heard of behavior analysis, nor had anybody instructed her about this way to teach self-feeding or about any of the other new programs she instituted herself. This is what can happen when an intelligent, motivated worker has the opportunity to observe behavior analysis being applied. And seeing this kind of learning take place is a reinforcer that scientists who confine themselves to their laboratories are missing. Also, more of this kind of interaction will be needed if society is to recognize the value of behavior analytic science. Another thing we learned quickly, perhaps because we had already learned it in the laboratory, was that we were not always teaching what we thought we were teaching. An informal experiment by Barbara Ray brought home a simple but most important lesson. In brief, that lesson is that it's easy to deceive ourselves into the belief that we have taught pupils one thing when actually they have learned something else. Here's an excerpt from her report. BR said, I wanted to follow up the suggestion that we had to teach the boys first to listen to sounds before we could teach them to say the sounds, and to develop a method for teaching them the necessary auditory discriminations. I started working with the letter A. I wanted the boys to run across the room and then come to me for a token whenever they heard the sound of A. I started by just telling a boy to walk over to the corner, pointing and giving him every bit of help I could to make him understand. When he got there, I told him to come to me, and I gave him a token. In this way, I established the pattern of having the boys going across the room to the corner and then coming over to me, getting their token, and sitting down. Then I said, "Now, when I say A, go over there." I started out saying a lot of letters of the alphabet that were not A to see if they would go. None of them went to the corner on any letter, including A. Then I started giving them extra cues. When I started saying the letter A, I would also point, raise my voice, and continue to repeat the letter A. So I was giving them at least 4 different cues: the letter, the pointing, raising my voice, and the repetition. I decided to see what was getting Dennis, Richard, and Kent to go across the room. They were always doing it. Whatever I was doing was getting them to go across the room, but I didn't really know which of the cues they were using. The first thing I did was to cover my mouth when I started saying the letters. When I started with a long string of letters, emphasizing the A, they all sat in their chairs. So it wasn't the raised voice. When I said the letter A without raising my voice, they just sat there. So it wasn't the letter. I then kept repeating the letter A. They did not use the repetitive cue either. Then I found out what they were using. Both Richard and Kent were definitely using the motion of my hand. I even said, "Go ahead," to Richard, and he didn't move. He was watching a pencil with which I was making slight pointing movements. His eyes were glued to the pencil as I went through the letters. Kent also was using a visual cue, a gesture of my hand. They would both go whenever I gestured, but not when I said the letter A, when I raised my voice, or when I repeated the letter. Their behavior was completely under visual control, not auditory, and that's pretty bad. To detect such instances, practitioners and researchers have to be skeptical about their seeming successes. We learned quickly to question our first impressions when it looked as though one of our boys had learned what we were trying to teach him. In the laboratory, we had found it necessary always to question the obvious. In our new practitioners' roles, we found that same skepticism to be warranted. The properly skeptical teacher or other practitioner will always ask, was the pupil's new behavior the result of what I think I did? He or she will even ask, did I really do what I think I did? In asking and answering these questions, practitioners become effective scientists, and scientists become effective practitioners. As is well known, it's often difficult to get pupils to generalize what they have learned in the classroom for use outside. Working with the boys in this project made the road to generality quite obvious to us eventually. For example, it became clear that when we taught them to recognize or to say words, they were learning something that had no significance for them outside the teaching situation. Even before trying to build up a vocabulary, we had to get across the notion to the boys that speech has a function, that they can say something and have something happen in the world as a result of what they say. When a particular kind of action comes to serve many different functions, that is to say, when it leads to many different reinforcers, you'll see that behavior again in all situations in which it leads to some reinforcer. For example, after we required the boys to be fully clothed before they could participate in any reinforcing activity, remaining dressed turned quickly into a generalized reinforcer. It made all other reinforcers available, including all the opportunities to earn tokens. We turned the tokens into generalized reinforcers by consistently requiring the boys to use them to purchase all other reinforcers. That, then, is the key to generality. Behavior will appear in new situations to the extent that it leads to occasions for reinforcement. The more reinforcers or occasions for reinforcement that some particular conduct makes available, the more that conduct will generalize. Once, an unplanned demonstration of generality took place. One day, all the tokens in the building disappeared, except those in the possession of the boys themselves, of course. Later in the day, we received a call from a worker in another building, which Jackie visited every day to take part in some research. This worker was a young lady of whom Jackie had become quite fond. She had told Jackie that she was saving her money to buy an automobile, and Jackie had asked her how many tokens an automobile would cost. She had replied casually, "Oh, it would take 1,000,000 tokens." Well, the young lady reported that Jackie had brought her a bag filled with hundreds of tokens. In our initial efforts with speech and articulation, all of us made a concerted effort to observe the boys' verbal behavior and to include it in the token program. We gave them tokens for speaking instead of using gestures, for pronouncing more carefully, for saying please and thank you, and for stringing words into longer phrases and sentences. As a consequence of these efforts, the total output of verbal behavior from the boys increased remarkably. After 4 months, when people whom the boys knew came into the building, they immediately heard about everything that had happened during their absence. The task then became not only to increase the boys' verbal communication, but to channel their verbal activity into useful and constructive areas. The following excerpts from a conference illustrate some of what we were learning. CP said, "I had the boys from the pronunciation and vocabulary building group. I used the flashcards. I showed them the pictures and asked them, 'What is this?' When I got the word, for example, cake, I asked them what they did with the cake." MS. That was a good thing to do, to try to carry on a conversation about simple things. In that way, you build up their vocabulary, and at the same time, you teach them to use the words. Even more directly, it would be good if you could teach them to use the words in such a way that there's some immediate consequence besides the tokens. Like pencil. You can do something with a pencil that has an effect on the environment. It makes marks. With crayons, they can make colors. Cakes can be eaten. Bring things like that into the teaching situation so that the boys can immediately get other effects from the environment besides the tokens. Eventually, the boys have to get their rewards from the communication process itself. We have to shift to that from the tokens. Bring in some candies and discuss the candy wrappers. What's on the candy wrappers, the color of the wrappers, and the color of the candy, and whether it's hard, soft, long and thin, or short and fat, and compare these to other objects that have similar kinds of properties. Perhaps even have the boys ask the questions and get them talking to each other. There's no point in just teaching them a long list of words. Mrs. Cassidy made the following note. At breakfast, Bertram was helping by giving out the bread and butter, while I did the chocolate milk. I was making each boy ask for the milk by saying, "May I have chocolate milk?" They were not served unless they said as much of this as I felt each one was capable of. Bertram was making each one say please and thank you for bread. And each time one answered correctly, he would say, "That's right." Bert was a Down syndrome teenager, and he was quite on to our reinforcement system. Finally, he got to Leroy, who said please for his bread, but would not say thank you. Bertram would not let go of the bread, and I was frightened that Leroy would start an incident. Leroy was a large, strong boy who was frequently destructive. So I went over and took the bread, letting Bertram continue to give bread to the other boys. Leroy finally said thank you. At this, Bertram turned and said, "About time." I think we can turn the projector off. Thanks. I won't be using that last transparency. So there are some highlights of our project in its early stages. We never wrote this up as a research report, and we never will. Why not? Because so much was happening, all at the same time, that we could rarely attribute general changes to any particular procedure of ours. As the token system became effective, the boys learned about new kinds of reinforcers. They learned to save. They began to buy things from each other. Learning became reinforcing in its own right. Much learning took place through imitation. New personal relationships developed among the boys and between the boys and us. And as the new reinforcement system matured, it remained in operation whether we were there or not. These kinds of developments produced changes whose precise causes we could not pinpoint. What we had done was to create a community devoted to learning, to change. What we did affected the boys' behavior, and what the boys did affected our behavior. Everything that happened had an effect on everything else. We were all changing, all the time. Well, not the stuff that experimental science is made of, but valuable nonetheless. Although some of us knew the scientific principles quite well, we found out quickly that those principles did not give us a fixed set of procedures. Rather, they helped inform us what to do next when a particular procedure did not work, or when a particular problem arose. What would you do when Bobby acts as if he's having a convulsion? When Stevie leaves out some of the letters of his name, what would you do next? How would you deal with the stealing of tokens? When Paul copies straight lines and circles nicely but fails to copy squares, what might you try next? What does it suggest to you when Richard seems to copy vertical lines perfectly but continues to draw a vertical line when you ask him to copy a horizontal line? How do you react when Leroy goes around breaking windows with his bare fist? What would you do to keep the boys dressed, even after they no longer receive tokens for remaining dressed? Well, such situations are too numerous and varied for them all to be dealt with in texts and lectures. Our discipline has become formalized. Training has become more a matter of learning rules than of experiencing contingencies. We place a growing emphasis on academic degrees and on oral and written qualifying exams. We certify individuals in training programs via written examinations, formal protocols, and personal testimonials. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of these. But we need workers who know not just how to talk and write about behavior analysis, but who know how to do behavior analysis. Education is the area in which Skinner's discussions of the differences between rule-governed and contingency-governed behavior become most pertinent. My hope is that our story will encourage behavior analysts to place more emphasis on actual experience with the basics in training others and themselves to solve applied problems. Also, to the extent that our scientists become practitioners and our practitioners become scientists, our basic and applied sciences will continue to nourish each other. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm happy I was able to say something meaningful.